Good
Good
morning.
morning.
I
I
will
will
reconvene the
reconvene the
regular
regular
meeting of
meeting
the
of the
Board of
Board
Lane
of Lane
County
County
Commissioners.
Commissioners.
This
This
is
is
Wednesday,
Wednesday,
June
June
12th,
12th,
2024.
2024.
Welcome
Welcome
everyone in
everyone in
Harris
Harris
Hall and
Hall
to
and to
anyone who
anyone who
is
is
watching
watching
online,
online,
to our
to our
staff
staff
and
and
our
our
guests this
guests this
morning. We're
morning. We're
glad you're
glad you're
here.
here.
We
We
have
have
just
just
one
one
agenda
agenda
item this
item this
morning,
morning,
although the
although the
board will
board
be
will be
taking up
taking
some
up some
unfinished
unfinished
business
business
after we
after we
conclude the
conclude the
one
one
published
published
agenda
agenda
item.
item.
And this
And this
comes
comes
from
from
our
our
County
County
Administration
Administration
Office
Office
and
and
our
our
Policy
Policy
Director,
Director,
Steve
Steve
Adams.
Adams.
I'm not
I'm
sure
not sure
which of the
which of the
Steves is
Steves
going
is
to
going to
kick us
kick us
off,
off,
but
but
this is
this
a
is a
really
really
wonderful
wonderful
moment that
moment
we
that we
get
get
each year
each
where
year
we
where
hear
we hear
from
from
the
the
Policy
Policy
Lab
Lab
students at
students
the
at the
University of
University of
Oregon. I
Oregon.
know
I
we're
know
all
we're all
really
really
interested and
interested and
excited to
excited to
hear
hear
what these
what these
students have
students have
discovered as
discovered
they
as they
dug
dug
in
in
to some
to some
issues that
issues that
we
we
grapple with
grapple
here
with
at
here
Lane
at Lane
County. It's
County.
always
It's always
great to
great to
get
get
fresh
fresh
eyes
eyes
and
and
perspective
perspective
on
on
the
the
work that
work
we
that
do
we do
here.
here.
So
So
I'm going to
I'm going
turn
to
it
turn
over
it
to
over to
staff and
staff
let
and
you
let you
all
all
introduce the
introduce the
students,
students,
introduce
introduce
our
our
guests from
guests
the
from the
university,
university,
and take
and
it from
take it from
here. And we're
here. And we're
just
just
along for
along
the
for the
ride to
ride to
watch and
watch and
listen
listen
together.
together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I just say something? It's hard for me not to say something about this program because it's really just one of the incredible things that we do here in Lane County. For this is the 6th year now that we've had this Policy Lab program running, and the idea behind it, and I think maybe Steve and Ben Clark and Annika will touch on this as well, but the idea from Lane County's perspective was, we're dealing with these real world challenges every day, big challenges that we're trying to solve in the community. And we have this university right down the street, our neighbor, with the incredibly talented faculty, staff, and students. And we wanted to create a connection between those two, right? How do we tap into the knowledge and thought leadership and research capabilities and analytical capabilities of the students and faculty at this top tier university to help us solve some of the challenges that we have in our local community. So that was the idea behind this. We've been 6 years running, and it's just, we all love this opportunity to bring forward not just the partnership, but the great work of the students and faculty in helping us solve these real challenges that we have. So I'll turn it over to Steve, but I just want to say every year keeps getting better, right? And that typically is the case when you have partnerships like this, is you learn and grow and you lean into the work and make some mistakes along the way, but it gets better every year. And so we're just really excited about this partnership and seeing where and how far we can take it.
Thank you, County Administrator. Chair Trieger, Vice Chair, Leval, Commissioners, thank you for the opportunity this morning. I'm really excited to lead this panel. This is something that these students have been working on for the last 2 terms. Work at the staff level began last fall as this current school year began, in which many of our directors identified vexing problems within their particular areas of domain. So this morning, you're going to hear issues that Director Gray elevated, that Mr. McCrae elevated, our wildfire recovery program, and Director Hurley, our public works director, elevated specifically as challenges. I had the opportunity to preview some of these presentations this past Thursday. There's some really thoughtful work here. This is such an exciting program. I don't know that I've ever shared even with my bosses, but a long time ago, I had the opportunity to sit for a master's in public administration, and I had to do a capstone project too, and it was in a different state and a different university. I managed to look at a county government and complete a capstone project without ever having had the first conversation with any of the staff or the electeds of that county. I got an A, and I got my degree, but I certainly did not have the kind of experience that these students are having. This Policy Lab piece has been the foundation with the capstone projects of a much bigger burgeoning partnership between county government and the University of Oregon's Policy School. You all will recall the wildfire summit that we were able to put on together as a partnership in the fall of this past year. We're already looking at opportunities to replicate that in the coming year, and really looking at how this partnership between county government and the University of Oregon's policy school can really inspire Oregon, inspire public policy solutions, and really advance many of the challenges. And some of that is the youthful energy and vigor of the students that we're able to work with. So this makes us better. This makes me excited to come to work on a regular basis. I'm able to kind of interact with the latest thinking within the field. How often do we have a chance to do that? It really does speak to the benefits of that. So we'll stop banging on about how much we enjoy this partnership. I am going to turn it over to Professor Clark, the chair of the School of 3 p.m. At the University of Oregon, and then we'll get this going.
And excuse
Professor.
me, really briefly before you do, I neglected to mention, you had mentioned to me before, just for anyone watching who's following the agenda and for my colleagues here, 2 of the items have switched places in the order that the presentations are being given. So we'll just introduce each one as it comes up. But 2 and 3 are switching places, just for anyone following along on the agenda online. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Chair Trigger, Commissioners. Thank you to the Steves. I really look forward to this day every year, sort of the culmination of the work that is ongoing in the Policy Lab. It exemplifies what the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management really strives for, is giving our students the hands-on experience to be able to excel in their careers. And the partnership that we have developed through a brief lunch conversation 7 years ago with Steve Mokryski is built into something that your staff put so much hard work into day in and day out to really help us be an example around the country. And I hear from people around the country saying, wow, this is really amazing what we're able to do. And I really thank you for your continued support in this. And the Policy Lab has evolved, as they have mentioned, and building into our next iteration, not only these student projects, but having the ability to be a convener for the thought leaders around the state coming here to Eugene, bringing the latest and greatest of a wide range of policy and management issues that face local governments around the state, and that's really through the support of Lane County that we're able to do that. The projects that we'll be presenting today come from 2 different classes. We'll have 2 classes from the Master Public Administration capstone class, and I will let my colleague Aniko talk about that briefly. And then the other 2 projects come from a class that is the first year in the Master Public Administration program called Public Management. These projects are shorter in duration. They're only 10 weeks. Really, they probably only have about 6 weeks worth of time to work on them, so much more compressed problems that they're dealing with rather than the larger, more squirrely ones that are happening in the capstone class. In the public management class, which is my class, they came about in a slightly different fashion. Just conversations that I've had with people around the state. In one around wildfire smoke management and sort of how different counties are dealing with it. So it's kind of looking at a very statewide issue, but has real relevance for Lane County and sort of how we're dealing with that. So I thought it would be something that would be relevant for this audience as well. And the other issue is coming out of a partnership we have in the School of 3 p.m. with the EPA and some other organizations around the country through the Environmental Finance Center for Region 10. So this project is funded in part through our partnership in the Policy Lab, but also through money from the EPA. And again, that's something that the projects in the capstone are also able to leverage, is that because of the support of Lane County, we're able to bring in hundreds of thousands of dollars in addition to the support we get from Lane County, and that really couldn't happen without, again, the support of the county and the staff to be able to think in a way that's different than a lot of other programs are able to do. Second project outside of the wildfire one is looking at the water issues in Mapleton. And so just kind of giving us some thought exercises about what are some potential options. I will continue to work with some of the students and with our partners in the Environmental Finance Center in Region 10 to continue to support Mapleton in kind of thinking about what the next steps are there. So I'll pass the mic over to Aniko from here.
Thanks, Ben. Chair Trieger, Commissioners, thank you so much for having us again. I just want to remind you a little bit about the capstone class that you're going to be hearing from today, because it really is the culmination of our public administration master's students experience at U of O. It's one of the last things they do. So this class starts in January, so that's when they all got onboarded to their projects, and they've been working hard on them ever since then, and they're all about to graduate this weekend. Yay! So they've done really amazing work. I'm excited for them to share it with you today. And just want to echo what everybody else is saying, that your support for these students and the applied experiences and the interaction that you give to them through staff at the county, through the partners that they interview through their projects, the focus groups that they do, all of this, and I can speak to this as well because I was a student that came through the program, is so formative in our professional careers. So thank you again for allowing them this experience. Today we're going to hear from two of the capstone groups. We actually had 3 teams this year, but one of them was more of a statewide project, so we're not presenting it here today. We're going to start off with our nonprofit administration capacity group that Eve has been working with, and we've got Eve here today too. They're going to share the work that they've done to support our smaller social service nonprofits. Then we'll have a sandwich of the Ben's public administration class teams presenting, and then we'll conclude with the second capstone group presenting about wildfire recovery. So that's our plan for the day. And with that, I will turn it over to our nonprofit group and let them get settled up here.
Steve, do you want to just take the other staff nameplate too? Unless you all are.
Welcome, y'all.
Something I don't know.
All right. Wonderful. Well, Chair Trieger and Commissioners, thank you so much again for having us here today. My name is Emily Severeid, and I'm joined here with my colleagues Josh Pugh, Cody O'Coin, and Gianna Linares. And we'll be presenting to you on our MPA Capstone project, which has been to develop a model to increase administrative capacity for Lane County nonprofit organizations. I've started with a short agenda here today of what we'll be walking through. So first, we will define administrative capacity, as we have been throughout this project, to kind of ground ourselves and center ourselves in this work and conversation today. Then I'll be walking us through the initial research phase that we completed for this project. And then I'll pass it on to my colleagues, who will cover our stakeholder engagement process, key research findings, a comparison of the approaches that we are recommending to Lane County, and then concluding with our final recommendations, strategic approaches, and next steps on this project. So like I said, what is administrative capacity? For this project, we've been defining this term as a nonprofit organization's struggle to further their missions while carrying out administrative duties, which include things like human resources, payroll, technology, financial management, and compliance-related tasks. These all are things that we've been hearing from our nonprofit stakeholders that we've engaged with throughout this project. And so we wanted to highlight them here today to kind of focus again on what exactly we're trying to address with this project. Next, I'll be going through our initial research phase. We started this project back in January, like Aniko mentioned. And at the very beginning of the project, we completed 4 case studies and literature reviews for different administrative support models to kind of consider what might be the best option for this solution here in Lane County. So to start, the digital transformation strategy uses data and technology to make informed administrative decisions, which can increase efficiency and effectiveness through operations. It is a contractual agreement. The services are provided both internally and externally with the technology at the nonprofit organization, and then externally the management of the technology system. It does have a high cost for implementation and maintenance, and it also has a high capacity to build that administrative capacity within a nonprofit organization. The centralized services model we looked at through two different lenses, the first being a professional employer organization and the second being a management service organization. And my colleagues here will go more into detail on that later, but that's an important difference to kind of keep note of. Again, this is a contractual agreement. It's a formal agreement where the nonprofit is receiving administrative support services from an external third-party agency. So with that, the service location is external. It does have a high cost, and it has a very high capacity, though, to build that administrative capacity within a nonprofit organization, which is really key for this project. Third, we looked at the cross-sector alliance model. This is a very informal agreement between a nonprofit organization and a for-profit business. And so it is not a contractual agreement, and it's kind of more based on values, shared values between that nonprofit and the for-profit business. The service location can be both internal and external, depending on the agreement between that nonprofit and the external party. So therefore, it has a very low cost to the nonprofit for like financial purposes, but it does have, I would say, a higher cost for the relationship management factor of it. And then it has a medium capacity to build administrative capacity within a nonprofit. And finally, the fiscal sponsorship model is a formal legal agreement that has several different approaches to how a nonprofit can partner or an upcoming project can partner with a larger entity. It is, again, a contractual agreement where the services are provided externally by that larger entity to a smaller or forthcoming nonprofit agency. It has a medium cost that often falls on that larger entity that's sponsoring the smaller nonprofit or forthcoming project. It has a high ability to build that administrative capacity. So I highlighted these four different models because that really kick-started our research process in this project. But moving forward through the rest of this presentation, we're only going to be focusing on the centralized services model because ultimately that is what we are recommending. And so again, as a reminder, we are looking at this through two different lenses, as a professional employer organization and as a management service organization. So keeping that in mind, I will now pass it off to my colleague Josh to talk more about our stakeholder engagement process.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of some of the stakeholder engagement pieces that we had in our project. Beginning with a little project timeline, in early January and late January, we began to compile a list of nonprofit organizations within Lane County, focusing on health and human services to outreach to for interviews. In February and March, we were able to complete these interviews, and I'll touch on them a little bit later as well. Moving into April, we were able to do 2 focus groups with these nonprofit organizations to deepen these relationships and understanding of what they needed for their work. And then in May, we were able to think about our final recommendations and what we were going to present to Lane County and Health and Human Services. And then finally, we were able to, here we are today, presenting to our advisory group as well as the Board of County Commissioners as well as our class presentations. And so for our interviews, we contacted 43 representatives within Lane County. We were able to complete 34 interviews, ranging from small organizations with less than 5, 10, 20 employees to larger organizations that cross counties with 200 plus employees. These were both conducted in person and virtually, and then we were able to reconcile our notes and get some organizational demographic information from these interviews, which kind of helped us with our research findings that Cody will talk about in a second. And then we moved into doing 2 focus groups. So we outreached to the same group of organizations that we did our interviews with. We were able to complete 2 focus groups with 12 nonprofit representatives. The main purpose of these focus groups were to deepen this engagement and understand specifically what cost structures, what location of services they needed, what in terms of contract flexibility they needed. So we really focused on that centralized services model and just really wanted to understand how can we customize a model that will really impact our local nonprofit organizations. And then now I'm going to pass on to Cody to talk about our research findings.
Yeah, so for our key research findings, I'll first go over our interview findings, which are all presented graphically, so I'll be referring up there often. And all of those graphs can be found in our final report, and then I'll cover our focus group findings after that. So during our interview process, we were able to identify the current conditions of nonprofit social service providers in the county, as well as their primary needs. I'll start with current conditions. So we first really wanted to get a gauge for and primarily operationalize administrative capacity by asking how many hours per week are you spending on administrative duties? And then we broke that data between small nonprofit organizations, so those consisting of 0 to 19 employees, and large nonprofit organizations, so those with 20 plus employees, and found that 42% of small nonprofit organizations and 93% of large nonprofit organizations spend 21 plus hours per week on administrative duties. This was even true for our largest interviewee base, which consisted of representatives of organizations with 0 to 5 employees. Regarding the most time-consuming, challenging, and costly administrative duties, 3 were mentioned the most. So over on the left, HR, 21% of small nonprofit organizations and 40% of large nonprofit organizations mentioned this. There in the middle, financial management, 47% of small nonprofit organizations and 53% of large nonprofit organizations mentioned this. Things like financial reporting and grant management were mentioned often. And then all the way on the right, reporting, 32% of small nonprofit organizations and 53% of large nonprofit organizations mentioned this. This was the most nuanced finding by far, differentiated for sure from financial management, but also distinction between contract reporting and grant reporting. And within grant reporting, is that coming from a public funding source or a private funding source? And all of that contain really different reporting requirements. And then for the primary needs, so 2 that were mentioned the most, staffing needs and funding needs. So for small nonprofit organizations, it was a pretty even split. 47% mentioned one, another 47% mentioned the other. For large nonprofit organizations, there was more diversity of needs. So 20% mentioned staffing needs. About a third mentioned funding needs. Some technology needs were mentioned, as well as some sector-wide needs, such as grant reporting and grant funding, and then contract reporting and contract funding, which Gianna will get into later. And then lastly, for our focus group findings, so come April, we held 2 focus groups. We already had a pretty good idea that we'd be recommending a centralized services model, and so rather than asking about general needs or just identifying current conditions, rather than presenting all 4 models, we just really focused on the centralized services model and asked questions about it. And 2 primary concerns were addressed. Contract flexibility, right? So if I'm a nonprofit representative, do I have a clear exit strategy from this contract? Can I review it regularly? Am I somehow trapped in it? You know, I've had bad experiences with contracts in the past, so on and so forth. And then cost structure. So am I paying for a service package? Some services I'm using, others I'm not. Or can it be more so of an a la carte, like I'll choose that service and maybe this level of that one, and it could be more so catered to me. Other common cost structures were per employee per month, per employee per year. It could have been overall annual revenue, so on and so forth. And then what we're calling advocacy domains, which Gianna will get into. But we present this here just because this was the initial context that we first heard this all described in.
Awesome, thank you, Cody. So now I'm going to go into our comparison of approaches. Like Emily talked about earlier, we were recommending the centralized services model, but this can be looked at in 2 different contexts. One is the management service organization, and one is the professional employer organization. Both act as an external third-party organization that provides these administrative services for nonprofits. The main difference between the 2 models is that a professional employer organization implements a co-employment model, which is where they are the entity of record for tax purposes for nonprofit employees. This allows them to not only do taxes, payroll, and other back office responsibilities like we mentioned earlier. It also allows them to pool employees across organizations so they have access to better benefit packages, which is something that our small nonprofits in our community mention as a big plus for this model and something that they struggle with. And so the first approach that we looked at was a partnership with the Lane Council of Governments. As you know, they've been in our community for decades, providing administrative services for park districts, school districts, other public agencies. After talking with some of their staff, they expressed their willingness and interest to provide these services for nonprofit organizations in our community. This would be implemented right away, as they already have the infrastructure in place. Nonprofit organizations would just need to approach the Lane Council of Governments to engage in a contract, and then these services would be able to be provided. The next partnership was with ADP Total Source. They are a private, for-profit national PEO. They have major clients such as Amazon, Dell, and other large nonprofit organizations like Goodwill. They are, like I said, a private PEO. We were unable to get some information on their cost structures and some of their contract information. We tried to outreach a little bit, but we were kind of met with some cold emails and everything. So we wanted that to be presented and looked at, because we had heard that some organizations, not the ones that we interviewed, but other ones that we looked at in the community, partnered with ADP, and they have had success. So we wanted to look into that a little deeper. The third partnership was with the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. They are a statewide membership-driven organization that supports nonprofits across the state. They're actually piloting a PEO model in January of 2025. However, there are some, it's just a pilot program for now, so there's going to be restrictions on who is going to be able to benefit from that pilot program, as well as there might be some potential restrictions in size and other logistics. So we took a little bit of a deeper dive into that model. And then finally, our fourth kind of approach was having Lane County create their own PEO. This didn't have to be Lane County, but other entities within Lane County. This could be easily customizable and individualized for Lane County. However, just like starting your own business or organization, there are very high startup costs and long-term maintenance resources. So we also wanted to take a look at if everyone decided that this would be a good option, to how Lane County could create their own PEO. And then ultimately, we decided, like I mentioned, to go with Lane Council of Governments as well as the Nonprofit Association of Oregon approaches. This was due to the location of services, how local it was to local nonprofits, as well as the infrastructure barriers, like I said, for creating your own PEO. And then finally, this infrastructure is already in place within our community. And so we figured this is an actionable recommendation that can be implemented very quickly. And now Gianna is going to finish it up with our final recommendations.
Thank you, Josh. So our final recommendation is going to be a centralized services model. This is going to be two distinct pathways that we're recommending. The first one that I'm going to talk about is partnership with LCOG. They're a little bit different from a PEO. They are a management services organization, or an MSO. And some of their distinct benefits is that they can cater to organizations of any size, whether that be 1 employee or 20 employees. And then another one of their benefits is that they are already currently offering these services. They're already up and running and are cultivating these partnerships with organizations in the community. One of their biggest drawbacks is that since they're not a PEO, they're not able to offer benefit solutions. They don't have those co-employment structures. Those benefit solutions were one of the most appealing aspects of the PEO model when we were talking to nonprofit representatives in our interviews and focus groups. And so our second pathway is going to be a partnership with NAO. They are a PEO, or professional employer organization. One of their benefits is that they do offer those robust benefit solutions, as I was saying, and they also offer more tailored services to nonprofit organizations, more of an a la carte style, so the organizations can be picking and choosing services that they are needing. And then one of their drawbacks is going to be their size limitations. Currently in the pilot phase, they are likely not going to be able to cater to organizations that have 10 employees or less. And then even when they scale up this program, it's likely that they're not going to be serving organizations of 5 employees or smaller. And another drawback, of course, is that they are not offering these services yet, so there's likely going to be kinks that need to be worked out. So next, I am going to talk about some strategic approaches. So the centralized services model is going to improve administrative capacity. However, there may be some external factors that are still hindering the level of capacity that they are hoping to achieve. So for starters, if nonprofits are evaluating their benefits from a PEO partnership, they're not seeing as much as they had hoped for. They're not quite seeing that improvement in administrative efficiency. They've really demonstrated their efforts to improve their to reduce costs. And so in the case that all of this has happened, at this point, we're going to be moving to the 3 areas of advocacy domains that Cody had mentioned. So again, these are domains that we came to a conclusion from based off of the feedback that we received from nonprofit representatives in our conversations with them. So these 3 areas of advocacy are going to be reporting requirements, overhead thresholds, and reimbursement methods. So at this point, advocating for an increased overhead thresholds, hopefully from 10 to 15%, aiming to shorten the reimbursement cycle from what the standard is right now, 90 days, to trying to cut it back to 60 days. And then finally, reporting requirements that was most heavily reported on as being very burdensome to their administrative functions, and trying to streamline those, simplify them, and just make them overall straightforward. And then finally, I'm going to conclude with some next steps. So for starters, there should be increased communication between, of course, LCOG and NAO should have a conversation. They are looking to serve the same people. This conversation has been going on for a very long time. They are looking to do the same thing, essentially. So they should talk. All stakeholders involved should be talking. In that sense, they should consider continuing an advisory group, ideally with all the stakeholders that were involved in this project, maybe thinking about appointing a neutral liaison to help maintain the partnerships. And one way that this could be carried out is going to be that LCOG and NAO are providing comprehensive presentations just to overall maintain that information sharing and transparency. They're also going to need to finalize their funding decisions. So there is still conversation going on right now about who's going to, if and who is going to be able to fund that pilot project. There are interested funders. Some nonprofits have also talked and asked about, are they going to receive support for those initial startup costs? And then also there needs to be a conversation around, are we aiming to have this be short-term or long-term administrative relief and overall industry change? And then finally, there's clearly still a lot of work that needs to be done. So for project continuity, this could be sourced from extra student support from the University of Oregon, ideally in the form of an internship. And things are going to become more clear as this intervention proceeds, but they could be helping with further research, program evaluation, or this was brought up in our last advisory group meeting, that they're going to need to get the word out about this. So maybe the student could be helping with outreach and engagement and social media content creation. And that was all that I had to share with you. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you again, Chair Trieger and Commissioners, for having us today. We would love to take this time, whatever time we have left in the agenda here, to answer any questions that you may have throughout our presentation. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I will turn it over to the board for discussion, questions, feedback, comments. Commissioner Farr.
Wow, brilliant. Very well done. And the first thing I want to mention is that around 10 years ago, we conducted work with nonprofits to ask, what is it that you need? How can government and other agencies help you? And came up with similar conclusions to the ones that you achieved today. Potentially a PEO, local PEO, and the startup administrative costs were formidable, and also the ongoing administration is formidable. Added expense that nobody seemed to have any resource for. Are your suggestion that LCOG is willing to do it? I'm encouraged by that. And bravo for digging deep into that, because they do have the resources, they have the facilities. The only thing there is that you say that perhaps fewer than 10 employees wouldn't be able to use their services without adjustments. And quite often it's the nonprofits with fewer than employees that need the services the most. You know, back then, a little bit of background, I was an executive director of a local nonprofit for a number of years, and we had some of the same issues. There are things that we needed to do that we didn't have the full resources to do, that we needed to pool the way we did them. And what you're bringing forward is really a very workable, potentially solution-providing approach. And I hope that we can carry it under our arms and make it happen, because this really is brilliantly done every step of the way. I've taken some notes on it. I have some notes about the process. I would ask, if we had a bit more time, did you engage with volunteers, and how much volunteer FTEs were involved with each of the nonprofits? Because Food for Lane County, which Commissioner Trieger and I both work for, extensively use volunteers. In fact, our FTEs and volunteers are far greater than paid employees, which can be a great asset, but it's also a somewhat tentative asset. You know, volunteers come and go. They're trained, not trained, you have to train, etc. But I will say, Chair Trieger and Professor Clark, this is brilliant. I hope that once again that we can take this. What you've done is you've taken some work that we started to do, that we tried to do, you've enhanced it, you've fine-tuned it, and you've really brought forward a presentation that really could provide solutions for the future. Pooling resources, the way LCOG does so well, the way ESD, an Educational Service District, does the same thing, provides to smaller districts things that they can't internally provide. And that really is the drawback to performing your duties, to whether it's grant administration, whether it's hiring, the hiring process alone. Also pooled resources such as supplies that each agency needs and uses, and you buy them retail, it's expensive. You buy them in a pooled fashion, you can draw on it and get it more. Anyway, I could go on for a long, long time about this. If I had stars, what's the maximum? 5? You got it.
Thank you.
Bravo, well done.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Commissioner Beck.
Thank you, Chair. And I appreciate those comments from Commissioner Farr. I was lucky enough to sit in a couple of meetings with you all because I am very interested in this particular subject. And it came to me kind of over the course of Recovery for Wildfire. I know that's like a second presentation, but they actually kind of blended quite interestingly, because we have a lot of federal money coming in and a lot of little teeny tiny nonprofits upriver who were thinking about how they were going to get services on the ground, but zero capacity to do the things that we're talking about here in this presentation with back-end services. You know, they have part-time staff, but people want full-time jobs, and there just isn't the same level of capacity or maybe education needed to complete all the different back-end management programs. And then you have to add the layer of compliance for large governmental grants that are astounding. And all they want to do is get services on the ground to people that need them. And this is the same story for any nonprofit that's really working in our community. In trying to solve this back-end office issue, I think is really critical for them to be able to get the services on the ground and not have to worry about all the office work and compliance issues that maybe a centralized system can really professionalize and do on their behalf. And part of the discussions we had was that nonprofits in some cases were a little bit skeptical of working with other nonprofits in order to make this happen, because they have individual proprietary ways in which they do business and the way in which they provide services to the community, and aren't always necessarily in a realm to be willing to share that and feel trusted in doing so. And so we had some discussions about that particular issue, and trying to find these solutions to maybe a separate entity that they can find trustworthy to do this work is really, really important. And in order to bring this, from a policy level discussion into fruition is what I find an adaptive leadership model. Like, if you can't adapt this to the real world and have an entity or a person or a body that brings it from this policy level to actual fruition and bring along all those nonprofits, then it won't actually happen. And so I'm hopeful that with the county's backing and maybe with a 2.0 of your body, that we might be able to continue this conversation and see what happens. Thank you very much for all your hard work.
Thank
It was great getting to meet you all.
Vice Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, great job, everyone. I know it's 6 weeks worth of hard work, and you probably didn't sleep much, and Starbucks probably made a lot of money off you, but so that's good. I appreciate you doing that. I got a couple of things that just as you were talking about them, I was relating to what the county was thinking, and you recommended central services model. And in the graph, it says that cost of that was high, and of course, we at Lane County experienced that in our last budget cycle. It increased $6.2 million. And so one of my first questions, and I don't know if this is where you want to ask questions, but is that model sustainable over time, or do you think maybe that model will eventually have to morph into something else? That's my first question. The second question, let me just have you think about that one, is that you said that, as things go forward, that things will become more clear as intervention proceeds about how internships and that kind of thing change the culture of nonprofits. And I think on top of what Commissioner Buck was talking about is about having a lot of these smaller nonprofits that cut the pie up so thinly. Do you think that maybe this PEO model or a central services model would maybe rally nonprofits to become more conjoined at the hip rather than individualized and siloed? So that was just my other thoughts. But so I know those are pretty complex and other 6-week questions. But yeah, good on you for stabbing that if you want to take a stab at it.
Chair Trigger, Vice Chair Lovell, thank you for the question. I think for your first question in terms of the financial and long-term cost savings, the hope with that, there are some initial funders within the state, Oregon Community Foundation, the NAO that has some donors and partners to hopefully offset those initial costs for a PEO model for these local nonprofits who, like you said, might not have these high resources to use. And then hopefully the goal over that, 2, 3, 4, 5 years is for them to, engage in these services, save resources, be more efficient, and then that cost savings can then, push them forward into the, moving forward with, engaging in those contracts and those cost structures. So that would be, we weren't able to take a deep dive into the financial assessment, but that would be the overall goal for this kind of model.
Sweet, good, thank you.
Chair Trieger and Vice Chair Lovell. Regarding the second question, I'm kind of being conjoined at the hip. There honestly might be a loss of perceived autonomy, especially for some of those really small organizations, right? If they're wanting to offload or outsource some of their administrative duties, right, onto a body of technical experts. They currently might have to do that at a loss for the centralized services organization. And so it's hard to tell in the future whether a centralized services organization can even offer those services to, we'll say, organizations with 0 to 5 employees. And so we mentioned this in our final report in hopefully a tactful way, but that might be very small nonprofit organizations considering collaborations like Emily got into, or even mergers, which I know is sensitive, but at least considering that at a sector-wide level.
Great, thanks.
Commissioner Seneca.
Yeah. Great work, everybody. It's for someone that's fairly new to the nonprofit industry, these numbers are great because I always look at things as a standardized model. There's got to be the best way to do that particular job, right? And so when you can narrow all that down and say we've taken this is what your rates in, what was the one I was just looking at, your hours per week spent on administrative duties. So as the county and as our partners, what is the best way to get this done? What is the best way to streamline this process? Commissioner Lovell brought up, it was a pretty dismal budget this year, and these are the things we can tighten up on. So I love the look of it from a business standpoint, and it's really exciting. I appreciate your guys' hard work, and it puts it all in perspective and focus. So thank you. I learned a lot just by looking at it.
Thank you.
Thank you. My challenge is going to be keeping my comments brief so we can get to the next, because this is my world. Worked in nonprofits for about 25 years before taking office. From small startups, I was the founding director of an organization where at first had me as the only employee through a fiscal sponsorship. So I was like, check. Through a fiscal sponsorship, ran the organization out of my home for the first year and a half of the 5 years I was there. And my tech support consisted of a Post-it note on my then high school senior's son bedroom door, said tech support. So, I feel the pain when we talk about smaller startup, but that's a whole other conversation too, how we define small. I also was part of the NAO, the Nonprofit Association of Oregon's work group many years ago, looking at exactly these issues: centralizing services, consolidating, bulk buying of health insurance, if you will, basically creating an entity in order to realize those kinds of savings. So it's really exciting to see that. Taking the next step and actually perhaps going somewhere. I think it's really important and really interesting that you talk about two pieces that really stood out for me, which is the reporting challenges, which is different than the applying for funding, than the reporting on funding, and the administrative overhead, the percentage that a lot of funders will allow for nonprofits to claim. And the onus isn't really always on the nonprofit, right? It's often on the funding entity or the oversight agency, where they are establishing systems and parameters that create a bar that the organization just can't meet. It's a systems issue, and this idea of a centralized or consolidated services, I think, is exciting because it'll give insight to some folks who haven't previously had to the challenges of running a nonprofit, which will just expand the table for who might want to advocate for these systems changes. So that's really important, that systems approach, because funders really need to change. I sit on a board of a statewide philanthropic organization, a funding organization that is really transforming how we do philanthropy and creating the lowest possible bar to accessing funds, but also really focusing on delivering funds to community organizations that are led by folks most impacted by the problem that they're there to address. And so my question for you is, I'm going to go deep here and kind of philosophical, is in your work, did you first even look at the sort of genesis of nonprofits? Because the reason, particularly on the social service side, the reason the structure is sort of the way it is they started as sort of volunteer, usually the men would go to work and do important things, and the women would be bored, and they'd create these organizations to do good deeds, right? To hand out food and clothes and for free, right? So the genesis of nonprofits kind of comes out of an idea that there should be free labor provided, and that's sort of on a different, that deserves different sort of treatment. And it really has become, as disparities have grown in our society, the need for those services has increased, but that foundation of it being, led by volunteers and therefore doesn't need the same kind of structural and systemic supports is kind of the root of the problem. So I'm curious if you dug in at all about that sort of, that foundational structural problem.
Chair, thank you for your question. I don't think philosophically we really went there, or even historically. When we were in communication with some of our larger nonprofit organizations, I forget the name of the gal that you interviewed. That's okay.
Oh, Shangri-La.
Yes. Mentioned like Senate Bill 606, which I think was maybe just passed not too long ago, which NAO is really advocating for, and I think really created that language. But it has a lot to do with, I think, pay disparity between different sectors, as well as administrative burden that they feel has been imposed on them by public sector. So again, maybe not the philosophical or historical route, but we at least had that conversation in an ancillary way.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and I think because, again, organizations often spring up from the community that needs the thing that isn't being provided by, and so even our whole definition of what does professionalism look like is pretty referential to a very traditional model, sort of. So I think this is really important work because it really gets at those structural and systemic problems and has an opportunity to really make a big impact. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Chair Trieger, Commissioners, thank you so much for this panel. I really, as this panel cycles off and the next panel joins, I really want to recognize my colleague, Ms. Linares, who is on this panel. She has been serving a paid internship in the policy shop. 3 days ago, she gave a briefing on reporting requirements under the Measure 110 reform that many of our leadership team are currently engaged in and unpacking and working against a July 1 application deadline for the second round of funding for House Bill 4002. She did a tremendous job there and did a great job too with this entire team. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So Chair Trieger, we're Trigger Commissioners, next up we're going to hear from Wildfire Smoke Communication, current practices in Oregon.
Chair Trigger,
Commissioner.
with apologies, I need to be excused for a few minutes, maybe more than just a few minutes, but I will return.
Thank you, Commissioner. And while folks are settling, just to my colleagues, I meant to mention, Commissioner Farr, my apologies, you mentioned to me earlier you had a previous appointment that you were going to have to step out to address. Thank you. We'll see you when you can get back.
Chair Trieger and Commissioners, we thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. We very much appreciate the opportunity. To start, I'm Wyatt.
I'm Ren Gainey.
And today we're presenting to you about our research project for the term, which focused on wildfire smoke communications, particularly current practices within the state of Oregon. Year after year, the frequency and severity of wildfires continues to grow in the U.S., especially in West Coast states like Oregon. As such, with this growing threat, clear, standardized, and effective communication is needed to ensure that the public is properly informed about the potential dangers of wildfire smoke, as well as the precautions they can be taking to mitigate these. However, anecdotal accounts from both local and state leaders in Oregon demonstrate inconsistencies regarding who holds authority on wildfire smoke communications, as well as a lack of standardized procedures for communicating related messages to the public. This lack of standardized procedures and authority, as well as the significant potential harm that wildfire smoke poses for public health, is what motivated this research project. In terms of the methods for this project, we collected qualitative data through interviews with public managers, cold calls with public health departments, and a literature review of the best practices in wildfire smoke communication in the current literature. These identified best practices include risk communication, empowerment and resilience, multi-channel communication, tailored messaging, and actionable guidance. Through these methods, our research project primarily sought to identify the current wildfire smoke communication strategies in the state of Oregon, as well as bridge the gap between current practices in the state and the best practices identified in the current literature.
So the first part of our qualitative analysis was 3 interviews with public managers in Oregon whose agencies work within either public or environmental health. The purpose of these interviews and our goal with them was to get an idea of the current resources that are available within these agencies that public managers and county governments can use moving forward to create communication plans regarding wildfire and smoke safety. The first interview was with Travis Knudsen with the Lane Regional Air Protection Agency. He's the acting director currently of LRAPA. LRAPA's goal is to create public communication channels around smoke safety and to promote outreach for that communication so that it can reach a large audience. He really emphasized the fact that they have a lack of funding due to the resource strain that wildfires ensue. With a growing occurrence of wildfires, with climate change and everything happening within the state of Oregon regarding wildfires, he really emphasized that more federal funding is going to be needed if we want to move forward. That being said, what they currently offer is air quality indexes, air advisory resources, and different recommended actions based on air quality levels. Those are open to the public, and also in the future, him and his agency would really like to implement more educational programs for county governments to give schools and other agencies a better idea of the information available to them. The second interview was with Gabriella Goldfarb of the Oregon Health Authority. OHA already has been known to offer a really good resource range for public managers regarding smoke levels and fire hazards. Some of these resources are within the Oregon Department of Human Resources office. This offers kind of acute care as well as a wide range of state officers that give care to communities during wildfire events. They also have the Office of Resilience and Emergency Management, which is more with acute care. And then, as well as the Oregon Wildfire Resource page, this aids in decision-making regarding wildfires. This page specifically has smoke maps, fire overviews, and fire hazards, and it also allows individuals to sign up for emergency alerts, which can be really helpful. The final interview was with Neil Barrett with Oregon Housing and Community Services. This tool and this agency is a really good resource for after wildfires ensue. That being said, they are more in disaster recovery. But Neil Barrett and I talked a lot about just future movement within this field, and he's very excited about kind of where it's going. They do have open communication channels with the public, and they want to engage more educationally, similar with LRAPA in the future when it comes to communicating when wildfires are occurring. And he also emphasized that it's a big public health risk, and as wildfire season gets worse, like I said, he wants to see more county government action within that. So with those interviews, what we did next was we cold called and had phone calls with the 36 public health departments of the counties within Oregon. This was to kind of get a more rounded idea of what's happening right now within these counties. We were able to make contact with a lot of them, not all of them, and we found some common themes within some of these counties. The first theme that we found was within Clackamas and Columbia. Both of these counties identified that they do not currently have a system for air quality issues related to wildfire smoke. They do have air quality departments, but they are not specialized within wildfire yet. The second was Deschutes County. This county identified that they rely on school policies when it comes to event cancellation. They also have OSHA guidelines for smoke-related health events. Within Josephine and Douglas counties, they mainly follow the state wildfire smoke plan. This is presented by the Oregon Health Authority, and they both said that it was very efficient for their communities and their counties currently. Within Klamath County, they rely on EPA regulation, and they look for federal guidance when it comes to wildfire smoke decision-making. They also have scientific inquiry from external sources. In the Hood River and Grant counties, they use third-party knowledge and they hire externally similar to previous. They do not have any internal regulations as of now. And then lastly, in Lane County, they use the incident command framework, API levels. They look at the National Weather Service as well as NOAA when it comes to looking at how bad wildfires are, as well as the safety of smoke. Currently, they have a lack of funding that's affected their ability to work with community partners during wildfire events. They've done this in the past and would like to implement it again in the future because they found it very effective. So this list of counties were ones that we made contact with and had conversations with, but they were either unsure or didn't have information regarding how they deal with wildfire smoke. This was a really important part of our finding because it was a mass amount of counties that did not know who to direct us to or who to talk to when it comes to what regulations or processes they look at when wildfires get really bad. And then lastly, it's important to note these were the counties that we were not able to make contact with. Because of a lack of contact, we do not have any information regarding the processes that they follow when wildfires occur.
So with the insights discovered through our findings, public health managers in Oregon have a unique opportunity to develop and implement standardized wildfire smoke communication policies and strategies across the state. Establishing standardized communications procedures is essential for bridging the gap between current practices in the state and the best practices we identified in the current literature, as well as for effectively maintaining public health and saving lives during wildfire smoke events. Additionally, public managers should prioritize creating strategic plans that include clear communication procedures, protective measures, and resource allocations to ensure public safety during wildfire smoke emergencies, particularly for at-risk populations. To effectively implement standardizations and strategic plans, public health departments will need to collaborate with both healthcare professionals and the Oregon Health Authority, as well as engage their communities through feedback mechanisms to ensure that wildfire smoke communications sufficiently meet the needs of the public and those directly affected by wildfire smoke. Overall, this research project and its findings provide a solid foundational understanding of the current state of wildfire smoke communications in Oregon, as well as the practices necessary for effective wildfire smoke communication. These practices can be used to guide the standardization and improvement of current strategies and policies in the state, which will ultimately foster better protection of the public from the harms of wildfire smoke and associated poor air quality. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Unfortunately, a topic we're familiar with, so I'll turn it over to my colleagues for any questions, response, feedback. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Yeah, unfortunately, we deal with this pretty much every summer. And it is very interesting in your research to note that different counties are doing it all different kinds of ways or not at all. And unlike systems that are built for the emergency management system and putting up an emergency operations center, which are very well known, they've got special ways in which they communicate amongst all partners, and that is from the federal level all the way down to the local level. And when you're in that emergency operations center, everybody knows exactly how things are going to work. And the communication structure is very formal. In the case of wildfire smoke, or just smoke in the air, that doesn't seem to be integrated into that structure in any way, or at least in any systematic way. And with the amount of smoke that's in the air continually each and every year, it feels like people are kind of band-aiding it as much as they can because we don't have that formalized system. And so your recommendations of standardizing the messaging, standardizing the communication, to me, just speaks of inserting it within the emergency management system. And we do have to activate when these smoke domes come over our communities. And we do have to find ways in which to find shelter and get clean air into people's homes so that they can just function. And oftentimes they can't even exit their homes because it is so bad, especially if you're, say, in Oak Ridge, where smoke domes are prevalent. So I'm trying to take this recommendation and your research and apply it in real life. Is there a way to actually transfer wildfire smoke into our emergency communication plan so it can be more formalized and each county would know exactly what to do and would be able to access further resources would be extremely interesting to me. Thank you for your presentation.
Commissioner Seneca.
Yes, I love the theme here, standardize. I'd like to echo a lot of what Commissioner Buck said there, but in part of the reason for this is, you know, a lot of companies and other entities look at us for what are we doing, at what AQI are certain things happening. I have a question, and maybe you didn't get into it because it's not necessarily part of the strategic plan, but did you guys delve into the accuracy of the AQI at all? Oh, there's a smile.
Chair Trigger, Commissioner Seneca, thank you. I had a conversation with Travis Knudsen about that, and there was definitely confusion around whether AQIs were a valid source of communicating bad levels of air quality. Because there's not as much federal recognition, the research that's put into AQI levels and how we formulate them to the public is not funded enough, I would say. I think that they're a really good base point, and I think that going off of them and then creating standardized systems so that people can open the weather app, look at the AQI, and understand what it means is really important. But the lack of understanding, I think, is where the blockage for public communication is coming.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, because I've always kind of wondered, because you do that. That's exactly what you do. You look at your phone, and well, it says it's healthy, and I'm telling you it's not. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Appreciate it.
Vice Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, being Vice Chair on the LRAPA Committee, I'm quite familiar with Mr. Travis Knudsen. He's an excellent resource in this community for sure. He was a former weatherman. You do know that, right? He brags about that all the time. And usually back then we used to watch the news and get our AQI and figure out if we're going to go running the next morning or not. But I think when you talk about federal funding, and yes, the standardization is, I think everybody should be standardized. That's a great idea. But I think what's happening with LRAPA is we're having to decide where and how many monitors we have and where they can be put. Like Commissioner Seneca said, you know, it may say healthy on your weather app, which means it's the closest monitoring system to you, and you've got this wave of smoke going through your house. So I think that's really the issue, is we need more monitoring places, and that's what LRAPA is looking to do in the next couple of years. But it kind of amazed me that the list of people you had on there that didn't have a plan, and Coos County comes to mind. And Coos County's got a lot of forest in their county, and maybe their plan is because they have coastal winds, it's all going to blow into the valley. I don't know, is that their plan or not? But it's kind of wondering that they don't have a specific kind of plan for what they do. So that kind of a little red flag in my gut. So I'll have to call those guys down there and see what's going on. So anyway, thank you for that.
Thank you, Commissioners. Again, thank you for the presentation. This idea of AQI and what does it mean, and is it standard, and how we sort of crowdsource it. I live right near a monitoring station, so when I open my app, it can show that deep dark purple, but that's because I'm right at the densest place, and it also doesn't differentiate. Is it wildfire smoke? Is it exhaust, right? That's also a bus turnaround spot, so probably it often looks really bad right there because there's a lot of exhaust right there. So that issue of the AQI sort of validity as a measure or standard is really interesting. I'm also really interested in this because while your title of your project is wildfire smoke communications, there's other events that give us poor air quality. And really, air quality is even more expansive than just connected to wildfire. And I think because we've experienced such intense wildfire on the landscape here in Lane County, we have to remember that we often have smoke that isn't from fire on our landscape. It's blowing in from other areas. So there's broader application to this than related to the urgency of something is literally on fire in our backyard. And so I think that's really important, and potentially, like I said, even beyond wildfire smoke. Because of the inversions we have here in the valley, there's often really poor air quality for non-fire related issues. And I also really like the idea of creating some shared language, both for how partners talk to each other about what triggers what kind of response, but then how the public sort of understands things the same way. Just creating that shared language is really important for everybody to understand each other. So important work, great work. Thank you.
Commissioners, thank you so much. Really appreciate the presentation from Mr. Bean and Ms. Gainey. Thank you. So Chair Trieger, Commissioners, next up is evaluation of wildfire recovery, a theme, lessons for agile government. So joining you will be Mr. Adamczyk, Mr. Gardner, Ms. Bryant, and Ms. Burke.
All right, first of all, thank you, Chair Traeger, Vice Chair Lovell, and the rest of the commissioners for being here today. It really means a lot that you're willing to listen to our 20 weeks of research that we've been working on since January. My name is Susanna Berg. These are my colleagues, Jenna Bryant, Brendan Adamczyk, and Evan Gardner, and we're here today to talk to you about long-term disaster recovery policy recommendations that were as a result of the disasters in the 2020 Labor Day fires here in Oregon. We started out with the scope of research just on the 2020 labor fires, but after our doing our interviews, we realized that these recommendations could be more broadly applied to all natural disasters across the country, regardless of size of jurisdiction. So, Jenna, go ahead and go to the next slide. So I'm going to kick us off with a brief project overview, and then also go into some of our key findings, and then I'm going to pass it to Jenna. We have 3 policy recommendations. Jenna is going to take the first, Brendan's going to take the second, Evan's going to take the third, and also introduce our next steps, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So, very briefly, what is this project? This started as a federal grant from the Department of the Interior called the Grow Back Better Grant. There's sort of 2 facets to this grant. There's the nonprofit sector side of this grant and the public sector side of this grant. So the nonprofit folks on this are also within 3PM are researching how nonprofits can play a part in long-term wildfire recovery efforts. We're taking on how government agencies can help streamline and make wildfire recovery efforts more efficient. I do want to take a moment here to distinguish the difference between wildfire recovery and wildfire response. Wildfire response is the immediate impacts of wildfires when the fires are burning and people are in immediate danger. We're looking at the recovery efforts, which is when the fires are out and people are trying to return to their homes. So really briefly, how did we kind of collect our research? We started with a literature review that focused on agile government and government red tape, and then we did a couple case studies of other natural disasters across the country that were 2 wildfires and an earthquake. After we did our literature review and our case studies, we moved on to stakeholder engagement, where we completed 15 interviews with local government agencies. And we also did 1 focus group. That focus group and interviews led to our final report, which includes our 3 policy recommendations and our key findings. Who was our target audience? That would be you guys. We wanted to reach local government officials at the county and local level. We do have a secondary audience, which might be those in academia looking to learn more about wildfire and disaster recovery efforts. Next slide. So briefly, why did the 2020 Labor Day fires inspire this project? Well, they were some of the most destructive fires in Oregon on record. Over 1 million acres were burned and over 20 counties were affected. For the scope of our research, we focused primarily on Lane and Marion counties. Those were labeled the Beachy Creek Fire, the Lion's Head Fire, and the Holiday Farm Fire. These fires forced over 40,000 Oregonians to evacuate, and that's when the recovery starts, is how do we get these evacuees back in their homes, and that is still ongoing today, over 4 years later. So that was really the catalyst that started this research. So I'm going to go through some findings. These findings are things that we heard repeatedly in our interviews with local stakeholders. They're kind of key themes that we found that led to then our policy recommendations that my colleagues will be explaining. So you can go to the next slide. So key finding number 1 was that renters and medium income homeowners are the most vulnerable. This is often a result because renters don't always have that formal lease agreement. And then with medium income owners, they're on the cusp. They're not always qualifying for that financial aid, and so they often have to be fully responsible for the financial impacts to rebuild their homes or get back into their homes. Disasters do create opportunities for smarter rebuilding. This is kind of turning a tragedy into something a little bit more optimistic. Although the priority should be getting people back into their homes as soon as possible, it does provide an opportunity to pause and think about how to rebuild more equitably. And then also communication across government agencies is uneven. Sometimes there are too many cooks in the kitchen. There are a lot of government agencies that all want to help and do the right thing, but sometimes it can be overwhelming and inhibit efficiencies. Next slide, please. So, something that you might already be aware of is that nonprofits are highly valued in recovery efforts. This goes along with the stereotype that governments are not always the most trusted. A lot of these fires happened in rural areas where they already have a lot of distrust for government agencies, and those nonprofits are going to be familiar faces. They can often do more immediate services without government red tape, which I'm going to get into the next bullet point. Nonprofits are often staffed by locals, and so they have a little bit more trust. State and federal delivery was hindered by bureaucracy, also known as government red tape. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term, but it is when government policies get in the way of their own policies from working more effectively. And then the last key finding is that land use codes can restrict rebuilding efforts. A lot of our interviewees saw, say they wanted to rebuild their home, but it was built over 50 years ago, and they want to rebuild it exactly as it was before, and that's not going to happen because since then code enforcement laws have been changed, so it completely hinders the process. So those are our key findings. I'm now going to turn it to Jenna, who's going to start us off with our first policy recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. My colleagues and I are now going to talk about the policy recommendations that we developed over the course of this 6-month research project. These recommendations came out of our research and findings that Susanna was describing. We were able to refine these recommendations a bit further through a focus group with some public sector stakeholders in Lane and Marion counties as well. First, I'm going to talk about the concept of pre-funding for recovery. Then my colleague Brendan will talk about long-term disaster recovery managers, and my colleague Evan will talk about data management policy. Before I get into these, I do just want to reiterate what Susanna said at the beginning, which is that while we began this project by focusing on wildfire recovery specifically and looking at the outcomes of the 2020 Labor Day fires, we ultimately shifted our focus with these recommendations to apply more broadly to natural disasters across the state. We heard in our discussions with stakeholders that in this context there wasn't a meaningful distinction between policies for wildfires and other types of disasters. So we want to make sure that these recommendations can also apply to ice storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, and a variety of destructive events that can impact communities. Starting with the idea for pre-funding for recovery, this recommendation asks that local and state governments set aside flexible reserve funds that could be used to help communities recover from disasters. The idea here is that we heard repeatedly from our stakeholders that while funding is available from state and federal agencies, often that funding takes a long time to arrive to local governments. We also heard that the reimbursement process for funding can take a long time, and often local governments have to hold on to debt while they're waiting for reimbursements, and that can be really burdensome for local communities and can really slow the recovery process. So the idea is that setting aside flexible reserves that could be used for a variety of recovery activities would really help communities get on their feet that much faster. In terms of the activities that these funds would support, these include impact data collection and coordination, which Evan will talk more about shortly, as well as establishing long-term disaster recovery managers across the state. These are both separate recommendations that we'll talk about in more detail shortly. And both of these are example of activities that we have termed pre-recovery in our report. The idea with the term pre-recovery is that it's planning for recovery. So you can think about pre-recovery activities as separate from mitigation and disaster preparedness, but really thinking about the structures and frameworks that need to be put into place in advance of disasters. So even if we don't know the specific disaster that will occur in a community, we know that some disaster is likely to occur, so making sure that those frameworks are in place at the local and the state levels. Other activities that these reserves would help support would be needs assessments, land and housing surveys, and other types of recovery studies that would help us understand how communities have been impacted directly after disasters. And then it would also ensure that essential public services could continue to carry on with minimal disruptions. So that would include basic water and wastewater infrastructure, for example, making sure that communities have the funding to keep those systems up and running, and also that public administrators at the local level can continue to help their communities and continue to support recovery. For this recommendation, as well as for our other two recommendations, we have actions that can be taken at the local level and then actions at the state level. At the local level, we would ask that local governments establish some type of dedicated reserve fund for recovery. Ideally, this funding would be set apart from the general fund. We would worry that if it were within the general fund, it might be easily swiped for other well-needed but non-recovery activities. So ideally, it would be a separate fund. And then we would also ask that local governments create some type of framework for how they would manage and administer this fund going forward. We do recognize, though, that many local governments have some considerable funding restrictions that would make this really difficult. So at the state level, we would also ask that a state agency also set aside a recovery funding reserve. This would be serve as a type of insurance plan of sorts that local governments could tap into as needed based on community recovery needs sort of as they arise. So it would be held by the state, but it would be funneled towards local governments as needed. And similar to the local level, we would ask that the state agency in charge of this fund and any other relevant partners would establish criteria and protocols that really clearly outline how this fund would be administered and managed going forward. I'm going to pass it now to my colleague Brendan to talk about our second recommendation.
Thanks, Jenna. So with our second recommendation, like Jenna had mentioned, this is creating long-term disaster recovery managers in counties throughout the state. Now, you'll be happy to hear you've already done this. In fact, Lane County is the model with Matt McRae. And in fact, throughout all of our research and the folks we talked to in both Lane and Marion counties, we heard that Matt's a real model for what this kind of job can look like. But what we'd ask is that all counties establish this type of position at the same level as an emergency manager. And the idea here is to have a position in place before a disaster comes. So you have someone who's already installed, who knows the local and regional and state and federal partners, and who's preparing for recovery with that pre-covery that Jenna talked about. So this person would work to coordinate with those partners, thinking about at the state level, that could be the Oregon Department of Emergency Management or Oregon Housing Community Services. The federal level, that could be the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, or Housing and Urban Development, HUD. Also working after a disaster to work with elected officials like you all, community partners like some of the nonprofits that we've talked about, and other folks and the public to not only create priorities for recovery funding and think about how that funding can be administered, but then also report on progress, especially to elected officials, to make sure that there's transparency in how that funding's being spent. And then, like Jenna mentioned, working a little bit on that pre-covery work. You can think of this as perhaps reaching out to a local construction company, developing a scope of work that can be activated in the event of a disaster, whether that's an earthquake, an ice storm, or another wildfire, to more quickly help folks start rebuilding key county and local infrastructure in advance of a disaster. Next slide, please. So with this one, we have some local actions and state actions at the local level. Ideally, every county would establish this position. Again, we know a lot of counties have limited resources, so we consider that some more rural or smaller population counties might pool one position across multiple counties. Again, the idea that would be serving at the same level as an emergency manager. And then at the state, we'd want the state to ideally provide all or at least partial funding for these positions, given the acknowledgement that a lot of counties don't have these resources, but the importance of having one of these positions installed before a disaster. And we'd can ask the state to consider either requiring some kind of local match, potentially between 10 and 25%, or offering that position only if a county has established the recovery fund that we talked about for the first recommendation.
All right. Moving into our data management recommendation here. In our interviews and focus groups, we heard a lot of anecdotes, and there's just one I want to highlight to you all. We spoke with a local level organization that gathered survivor data after the 2020 wildfires, with the expectations that it would be shared to FEMA. FEMA would kind of collect similar level data from other local organizations and then collate that and pass that back down for use. In reality, what happened was the data went up, but it didn't come back down. So what we're seeing a lot is just difficulties with data management and communication. We're also seeing survivors being exposed to something called survey fatigue. Essentially, on one of the worst days of their lives, they're being asked multiple times to provide very similar information to different agencies. So filling out maybe 4 or 5 surveys, which is a very difficult thing to do in that moment. So moving forward, next slide, please. So the local and state and federal actions, starting with state and federal actions we want to implement are, number one, supporting development of a data collection plan to kind of ensure that that anecdote doesn't happen again, and data flows freely up and down from local and county officials and organizations up to the federal level. And then also creating a standardized data collection form. That way, survivors can be interviewed once, and that data can be shared through those predetermined data collection agreements instead of that 4 or 5 times we've been seeing in the past. On the local level, we ask that local agencies coordinate with state and federal agencies to work with and help establish those data sharing agreements and collection forms. And also something that we've was mentioned during the interviews and focus group we did was consider preemptively gathering key resident information prior to disasters. Next slide, please. That was also a somewhat contentious recommendation that we talked about, so I just want to acknowledge kind of the barriers to implementation for that specific pre-gathering information. There are privacy concerns with that. The idea that this would fall under the long-term recovery manager that Brennan discussed. Obviously, the privacy concerns would necessitate confidentiality agreements and things of that nature. As mentioned before, some of the more rural counties have just a general distrust of government in general. This might be seen as a potential overreach or something that shouldn't be in the purview of government, so there's a difficulty there. The actual development of the data collection form itself, with so many interested parties contributing and discussing this, it will probably be a challenge to kind of create that as well. And then the data storage of the collected information itself, our recommendation is to use an existing data management database to kind of eliminate the need for creating something new and trying to find new FTE to support that. Something like the HMIS model in Lane County could be an example of that. Next slide, please. Moving on to our next steps here. So these were things that were communicated to us that these were important, but we didn't necessarily have the time or resources to look into, or might be outside the scope of our project in general. So the first one was to create a recovery resource guide for local governments. Essentially, this is a playbook of sorts of best practices, lessons learned, things like that from disasters that counties can have on hand to refer back to. What we heard was some counties have a version of this, some have maybe a less robust version, and some really don't have much at all. So just creating some sort of standardized product that can be shared amongst counties. Evaluate how land use policies can affect recovery efforts. Again, we heard this was, can be a big tool in recovery. Unfortunately, we didn't have really the scope of this project to dive too deep into that. And then lastly, going back to the pre-funded fund for recovery, we heard a lot of, this organization shouldn't manage this fund. We didn't hear a lot of, this organization should manage this fund. So kind of diving more deeply into that and identifying, what agency ideally at the state level would manage that. Next slide, please. And with that, I want to thank you all for your time and open the floor for any questions you may have.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Really appreciate it. Great information, great ideas. Great call out to Matt McCray in the back of the room, who doesn't want to be called out, but we're doing it anyway because he does excellent work.
Stand up, Matt.
To my colleagues. Commissioner Senega.
Yeah, if Matt McCray comes to talk to you, I'm sure it's for recruitment. Great job. I guess there's two sides to it, right? We are doing it right, but in a way we're doing it right because we've been forced to do it right. I mean, this is a reality. This is what we're working with. We certainly do our best when we can in those kind of situations. And one thing that I took a note on, you said land use codes can restrict rebuilding efforts. Who were you guys talking with? Because I know we went out and we didn't charge for permits, and we had extra people on staff to try and help with this process. Did you guys get into what the concerns are, or what they're actually frustrated about as far as the rebuilding of what's been burnt down?
Thank you, Chair Trieger, Commissioner. So we did talk with a couple folks working on permitting here in Lane County, also Marion County, and I think really what we saw is that there were, as part of some of this rebuilding, some of those, like the rebuilding fees were waived, or there are other changes that were made to help assist with rebuilding now, but that also puts the county, whether it's Lane or Marion County, other counties, in a difficult position of allowing rebuilding that doesn't comply with current codes. So I think it's more of the balance between, like we were saying, trying to get people back into their homes on their land as soon as possible, with also not sort of continuing issues with those types of codes, whether it's sort of distance from the Mackenzie River was a problem we heard in Lane County for a lot of homes. So I think it's more thinking about kind of the balance between getting people in their homes quickly versus rebuilding in a way that we have a community that, complies with state code.
Right. Got it. Yeah, and that makes sense. Was, then you brought up survey fatigue, which I was thinking back on one of our presentations when we were talking about it. And along with that survey fatigue is people going up to take pictures because, this is a huge event. And, this is these people's lives. They've got everything wrapped up into this, and it really is something to be cognizant of what these people are going through. Yeah, thanks for your presentation. Really appreciate it.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. Like the third presentation in a row that is near and dear to my heart. I appreciate you taking this particular subject and continuing to run with it. We have a lot to do in recovery. And I've mentioned this before, but the state of Oregon and locally, we're really good at response to a disaster. We are not good at recovery. And your recommendations would take us up a notch in order to ensure that we can have a system of recovery at all times. I was just nodding my head through the entire presentation because I so fully agree with everything that you've stated. When it comes to pre-funding recovery efforts, I know we had some discussion about where that pre-funding money should lie, because if it's with an entity where there's electeds in the room and another hot topic comes along and they need a bucket of money somewhere and there happens to be a recovery fund sitting over here floating for who knows how long, it could be swiped at any time. And that happens at the state level all the time. You think you have money for something over here and somebody else's initiative or bill gets passed and the money gets passed over. And that can happen at any level of government. It could happen here locally if there is an urgent need. But trying to put some parameters and requirements about obtaining and use of this pre-recovery, which I love that term, pre-recovery amount of flexible funds is really, really important, meaning that something like only an emergency board could really allocate those funds from that particular bucket of money to ensure that they couldn't be swiped for some other reason, and to ensure that that is readily accessible in a quick manner for reimbursement was a really important piece that you wrote. I was writing just a lot of notes because there are things that we can do here locally to lift your messaging. I think the important part on your second one in long-term recovery disaster manager is that it's permanent. It's not only for a certain amount of years after a disaster. It's not a short-term position, because we know in between disasters, there's still a lot of work to do on an ongoing basis. Trying to come up with the resources to continually fund that position is always going to be challenging. And yes, we'd love the state to fund it permanently. But as we just mentioned in your first suggestion, that money gets swiped and that resource gets half-funded or partially funded, and then it dwindles because state resources go elsewhere. I don't know how to put some kind of guardrails around ensuring that we get state or federal funding for that position in an ongoing manner when we don't really have the means to increase taxes to ensure that we have that resource. But I'd love to see it happen. And lastly, on the data management recommendation, you know, it was abundantly clear in our disaster that FEMA does not share their information. And they won't, and we probably aren't going to be able to change that. They have privacy requirements that they just have to abide by, and there's nothing locally we can do about that. We can only find a data management system on our own that's going to work locally and that we can internally share with others. And the question that I have for you about that is, although the recommendation to have a collective shared data management system is really important, did you dive in at all to what exact data you should actually acquire and keep on record at all times in case of a disaster?
Chair Trigger, Commissioner Buck, thank you. So something that was discussed was not only contact information, but things that can help aid be passed out to survivors, so things like household size, household income, renting or owning a house, and things of that nature were kind of expressed as being important factors to kind of maintain and hold. And then also with our recommendation of having the state talk to local and county groups, kind of fleshing that a little bit more in those working groups and kind of deciding more on what exactly else should be included with that.
I'd love to see us be able to work on fleshing that out a little bit more, because you're right, people are going to be skeptical about sharing information. But at the same time, what is like the basic information that we will always need to know in case of a disaster? Because the question that we're trying to answer is, how do we maintain contact with people to provide them with the services and resources that they're due in the aftermath of a disaster and in recovery? How do we maintain communication with them in order to provide them what they need? And to try to keep up a contact list with phone numbers and addresses and email addresses of everybody in your county is maybe more than what we can do. But fleshing that out and finding a system that could work for our county or statewide would be really helpful. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, a lot of great questions that I had that my great colleagues already asked, so thanks for answering all of those. I think the only question I still have lingering left is the county that we're doing well at, Lane County, what would our pre-covery number be? I mean, Steve, you might help us out. I mean, we were at the ice storm. What was kind of that threshold of what we expended that this was going to turn into a statewide emergency? And I don't remember that off the top of my head.
It was about 8 million for Lane County of the 40 whatever million countywide.
1.8 million. Yeah. So I mean, would a pre-covery number be somewhere for a county our size, $1 million or $1.5 million, $2 million? I mean, that's the only curiosity that I had. Is like, if I'm thinking of of Harney County, for example. I mean, they got like what, 2,500 people living in there or something. I don't know. And what would the number for them be? So that would be just a curiosity question for me, just what those particular numbers would be like. So.
Well, I think, thank you, Chair Trigger and Vice Chair Laval. I think that with that, we didn't get too much into the exact specifics. I think one tricky thing as part of this recovery from the 2020 fires was that counties all had access to ARPA funding through, because of COVID pandemic, and that was not great because of the COVID pandemic, but great that counties had all of that money to spend on. I know Lane County hired, I think, 7 FTE of folks to coordinate, for building permits and rebuilding, and that money won't always be there. So I think for those counties, we'd have to see what that would look like on a county by county level. I think no fund will be able to cover all of the costs of recovery, but I think the idea is, again, we saw especially the smaller local governments of just trying to at least give them something to offset having to wait months or years we've seen to get that reimbursement back from FEMA for those funds.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you. Excellent presentation, important information. I love that word pre-recovery also, that you've taken us right to the sort of prevention mitigation and then insert pre-recovery before response and then recovery. So that's really helpful. That's great. I think this pre-funding, we have been talking about it because both as an entity, we face challenges because we're so constrained. All of our funds are so designated and the FTE goes with a different fund that when we need to pivot, we lose the ability to be nimble and pivot our workforce to response because people are filling an FTE that's connected to a fund. And it slows us down, even internally. So that idea of pre-funding both on behalf of community, so there's resource for them, but also for us to be more responsive and more nimble in our response is something we've started talking about. It's really important, and I agree, as you all mentioned, and some of my colleagues mentioned, the need to protect that fund and create the triggers for how it's spent and how it is not spent is key, even almost more than the amount that's in it. I think on the pre-event data, I agree. We've certainly seen that in Holiday Farm Fire recovery, that it's really a requirement to make good on our equity commitments, right? Particularly as to how many renters, because the people filing for claims on insurance or to rebuild are the people who own the home, and that tells us nothing about who was displaced from that home or where they are now. And there aren't resources to rebuild rental properties, and that's a big problem. Or lower income homeowners who were underinsured. I mean, there's all manner of issues around. But I agree, again, the mechanism for how that data is, what that data is, how it's collected, and then how it's kept relevant is challenging. I see an app in our future, I think, somehow, just because that's a way you can send alerts and have the people input their own data in a way that is in real time. So all really great and important. I have no doubt that the conversations you had in researching your project with our staff have helped our staff think differently about this work. I mean, that's the beauty for all of you of what you've done here today, and the whole point of the Policy Lab. It's to give you an opportunity to engage with local government and be thought partners and problem solvers, but the process of doing that also helps our staff think differently, see things in a new way, and take what you've taught us, really, in the process of the research work, and use it in our daily work. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair, Commissioners.
Chair Trieger, Commissioners, thank you so much. And our final panel presentation this morning will be looking at the Mapleton Special Water District. Like the wildfire smoke piece, this is one of Professor Clark's shorter classes. So this is not a two-term class, but a one-term class. So just noting that. And so presenting this morning on Mapleton issues, Mason Bartholomew, Jasper Ryogeist, Alexa Rossum, and Gavin Grant. Please. I guess. All right. The others are here in spirit.
Good morning, Chair Trieger and Commissioners. I'm Mason Bartholomew. I'd like to give, again, an acknowledgement of my partners on this project that could not be here today, Jasper Ryogeist, Alexa Rossum, and Gavin Grant. Our group was looking at the Mapleton Special Water District. As you may know, currently we're going to be going over agenda with first a brief background, solutions for what we think utilizing ORS codes to determine whether or not the options that the special district has, as well as our recommendations and any sort of limitations we've ran into. Starting off with the background, as we know, with also according to the ORS 451.573, Mapleton is designated as a special water district. Recently, as you know, they had a leakage in their pressure, which can cause contaminants and bacteria to spread. While being temporarily fixed, they're running into an issue where they're having an infrastructural funding problem. That same leakage cannot necessarily be fixed due to its age and due to the 501A2 IRS code that the special district has been designated under. meaning that they cannot take loan revenue that exceeds 20%, as well as cannot increase property taxes that exceed 1/4 of 1% of the real market value of the property in the special district boundaries. This will not be looking at fees that they do collect, as due to the socioeconomic status of Mapleton, we do not deem it viable necessarily to increase those fees on the residents. For reference, this is the boundaries of the Mapleton Water District. They get their water collected from the Berkshire Creek, which comes from the Siuslaw River Basin. So looking at the first method of 501.571, it's a little bit covered up there. We're going to be looking at dissolution and formation. Now there's two options that the special district can do. They can first dissolve their 501A2 special district status and turn it into a new special district that doesn't have those parameters set. Of course, this would take a 12 to 14th month long process that would require residents to petition for, as well as any other agencies to also acknowledge their input, and then that petition being sent to the county for approval. We will not be looking at the procedural process within this ORS code that the county will need to do during that procedure, but know that the county will need to approve that said petition, which can then keep the same district boundaries, but change the IRS categorization. Another one would be constitution to annexation. As you can see, there's a blue line surrounding the red line. The blue line would basically be the new boundaries that are set, and basically create a brand new special district, again, that does not have the IRS categorization, so they can take out larger loans for their infrastructure project. The original boundary lines within this new special district will be dissolved, and this would allow for any sort of assets or liabilities or obligations to not be transferred over to a third party. This would keep it within the special district, as well as then the volunteers on the board and any other individual residents can then manage. Another one would be consolidation. Here we have the ORS 264.335. Consolidation would require that then the Mapleton would find the nearest special district to them, and they would be absorbed by that special district. That special district will obviously need to accept and approve that they would want Mapleton to consolidate within them. However, this would require that the board on Mapleton be dissolved and any sort of employees that work with the treatment facility to be laid off, as those responsibilities would move over to the new special district that's consolidating them. In addition, this would not change the IRS categorization unless, of course, the IRS categorization for the special district that they're being consolidated into does not have that category. So if the IRS code did have the issue of not able to take out loans that exceed 20%, they would have, though, a greater pool of funding, as whatever special district they merged into, those two boundaries would create one larger boundary, meaning more residents, more pools of funding to go off of. But this would mean that the special district for Mapleton would not remain the same. An example which we have is Marin County Water District. This is north of San Francisco. They ran into a similar issue, and they wanted to create a water recycling plant to increase pipes and pumps, and so they merged with other agencies and special districts to then increase that funding. Now, of course, the limitation to this is this may not apply to Oregon's laws and codes, so this should be just more of a reference point. Another one would be merging, which is similar to consolidation. However, for a merger under ORS 198.885, they can merge these two districts together to creating a new boundary line. But instead of dissolving the Mapleton board, both boards would coexist, allowing for that Mapleton to keep the volunteer residents of Mapleton to control the responsibilities in Mapleton, and then whatever board that they're merging with to take control and keep their side. However, during this merger, this would require at least 2 elected Board of Commissioners from Lane County to sort of facilitate this merger, which would take a similar process of 12 to 14 months. Any sort of assets and debts and liabilities would then be shared across both special districts in this merger. I also forgot to mention that in the consolidation, all assets and liabilities would be moved over to to the district that they're consolidating into. But this one allowed to be shared across both, as both boards would still remain and both employees that work for those treatment facilities would still remain, keeping them local. Number 4 would be annexation. Under ORS 222.111 and the following ORS code, this would require a city nearby to sort of annex that special district and sort of take on these responsibilities, assets, and liabilities. However, the nearest one that we could think of would be probably Florence or Dune Cities, which not necessarily a viable option as due to the distance and would require the city boundaries to then stretch across to include Mapleton. And our 5th one here is county management under ORS 198.920. In case there's a situation where the elected board and sort of residents cannot petition a form to give to the county on what they want to do, the county can ultimately step in and sort of designate on what they want to do based off of the previous 4 solutions we have. However, this would require different necessary conditions. One of which, like I said, they do not have an elected board, or they can't petition for what they want to do, or the district may be not inhabited anymore due to residents leaving that special district. In addition, this would also require a proof of in the best interest of the residents in the area, which is defined onto the following slide under ORS 198.792 as a danger to public health. This could be used as an argument if the county wishes to step in due to certain circumstances, such as the pressure leakage, which can cause bacteria growth and harm to the residents. So there can be a valid argument if there's an emergency situation where the county needs to step in. However, though, and they would then annex the district and create a new one. However, we don't really recommend this, as this may set a precedent for then other special districts outside of Mapleton who are running into similar infrastructural funding issues to then go to the county to help with their situation. In addition, this would create all assets and liabilities that that special district had to go over to the county, which the county may not administratively be able to take on. So our recommendation is, first, we would recommend using the dissolution reformation. As we mentioned, having the board and the residents in the special district to petition for dissolving their IRS status and changing it to a new special district, one which they can take out larger loans for their infrastructure projects, as then it wouldn't require any sort of liabilities or assets to be moved to a third party, nor the county. If that is not viable, we can also do our second option, which would be the merging of the districts, as it doesn't change the IRS categorization, but does increase pooling funds. However, due to the limitations of having 2 board commissioners to run this merger, as well as having to find a special district that is willing to merge with them, is the other issue. We'd like to acknowledge any sort of limitations we might have had here, which is the time restraints due to being one term and due to communication with certain individuals that we needed to contact. We weren't able to get into, like I said, the deep procedural process within each of these ORS codes. In addition, there was a lack of data. Lane County, when comparing to other counties adjacent to Lane County, their website does not have an easy accessible map or GIS map that showcases where the special districts are in the county and where those boundaries are. But every other county adjacent to Lane County has that access. In addition, we were unsure about Mapleton's financial position, as we know that they do collect fees, but we focused more on the governance end and not the fee side. And the case studies provided, as I said, may be limited due to being in other states, as it is very difficult at the moment to find case studies in Oregon, but be sure that other special districts who are running into this issue will become those case studies. And like I said, there was more of a focus for governance. Thank you so much. I'll now leave it open for any questions for myself.
Thank you. Thanks for taking it on solo as well. I'll turn it over to my colleagues on the board. Commissioner Senega.
Well, finally, Commissioner Buck, one that pertains to me. Mason, thank you. I've been working with Mapleton since before I was elected as a county commissioner 18 months ago. Is there any special water districts close to Mapleton that any of these mergers or consolidations could work with?
Well, so the merging doesn't have to necessarily be just a water district. It can be any other special district. We know that Florence has a sanitary district. However, I was not able to definitively showcase a map of that due to the limitation of the website and Florence not having a designated boundary map, unlike Mapleton's website, which I was able to provide in the slides.
Okay. Yeah, I made a note of that. And that's probably something we can work on, getting our special water districts on there. You may have seen Mr. Adams and I kind of looking at each other throughout your presentation. So did you address rate studies or deferred maintenance at all, or how do these special districts get to this point? One of the things I was thinking of was you said your case studies, you don't have any yet. Well, I think in the near future you're going to, because you are correct. This is something that is going to continue to happen as these systems age out. So was there any research done into that?
No, there wasn't necessarily like on deferred maintenance processes or anything. I was able to get in contact with Cresswell, in which they're facing a similar issue with their special water district, where they are also not having funds in place due to the IRS limitations to help maintain these sort of infrastructure projects. And they were acknowledging, saying that this is going to be an issue where they were thinking of coming to the county with, but they're still up in the air about.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that dissolution and reconstitution is, I mean, that's something that I haven't heard or been talked to about. So, great work on looking through that and finding that piece that could really help, because I just yesterday I got a text that now they don't qualify for the BRIC grant for their new storage tank. I mean, so it's just, constantly they're up against these things, and whatever we could do to help, even if it's something simple like that, that's a great solution. I sure appreciate it. That was great work. Great work.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Trigger. And Mr. Bartholomew, is that?
Bartholomew.
Bartholomew, I beg your pardon. What you provide, I'm not going to cross-examine you on your presentation, the details of it, but I'm going to comment on the thoroughness of your analysis and the downstream effect. You provided an analysis that would have cost, I think, a lot of money to achieve. You provided it free of charge with your and your colleagues' blood, sweat, and tears, as Winston Churchill would have said. But you did a very thorough analysis and came up with a recommendation at the end, which on face value, and that's all I'm able to comment on, I would support, because it really seems to be the most viable direction to go. But it's a difficult situation in that small community, one that they don't have the resources to address. Well, you provided one of the first resources. What are the options for addressing it? And from there, they can seek help in moving forward with permanent solutions. You've done a brilliant job in helping, once again, define permanent solutions that potentially can affect future generations for years to come. So bravo, well done, Professor Clark. Same as I said last time, and I apologize for missing 2 presentations. How many stars can I give you? Well, you got the max 5. Well done.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Although this isn't my district, I have special districts with a similar issue. It's just prevalent in rural areas. We have these special water and wastewater districts, and it was very interesting for me to understand that there are IRS limitations to the funding mechanisms, which I also was not aware of. So that was a key piece of information. I have also looked at what we can do for loans, for our districts. For example, Dexter. The issue with a loan is that you still have to increase rates for a public area that is very low income. And even with a loan, it might be more than what they can afford, and trying to find other ways in which we have government infrastructure funding to help, lower that loan amount is really key, and even that is hard to find. But if you can't even get a loan out of any size because of the IRS limitations, you're really in a bad way. I learned some today, so thank you very much.
Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair Mason. Great job. You have a great radio voice and a face for TV, I might add. So there you go. You should cash in on both of those. Yeah, I mean, what Commissioner Buck said and Commissioner Sanega, that community is such a limited resource. But, you know, you said something about this will be a case study for the future. But representing Springfield, Springfield's got the same problem. I mean, they're not immune either. They are a water district that absorbed 3 other older water districts. And even in our latest development, we had some water pressure issues that they're going to have to really take a hard look at their infrastructure. So this is not just an isolated problem to small communities. This is everybody. And because, you know, back in the day when the loggers were in charge of, you know, that area, they got their guys and they got their backhoes and they went out and they put some water system in it and buried some pipe. And now we're going to have to redo most of our state system. So this is a problem we're going to have to look at going forward for a big time scope. So I appreciate you bringing it to the table, and hopefully soon we'll find some solutions. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you for the presentation. I also found it really interesting that the designation by the IRS put some limitations, right? The whole issues with anything, but especially with funding for special districts or looking at ways to reimagine that is, you know, viability, sustainability, and then scalability. And we have, I think, is it 185? I'm looking at our assistant county administrator, 185 special districts in Lane County. Yeah, because there's, you know, water districts, library districts, ambulance districts, cities, school districts. So the idea of some mergers and consolidation, you know, might make sense, but similar to what we heard in the first presentation around nonprofits, there's a real identity associated with districts, the way there are with nonprofit organizations with names and missions, and the people being served directly don't always want to make those changes, and that's in many cases with the districts who would have to, either the board representing those people or the people themselves, if it was going to be something put to a ballot to reform a district. So lots of complexities. I'm curious, did you have an opportunity also to talk with our tax assessor about the percentage of the property taxes Lane County collects that go to the district, and what the calculus might look like to a merged, expanded, annexed district, those comparatives?
Thank you for the question, Chair Trigger and Commissioners. We were not able to, though that is something that is further looked into. We did when we were discussing with our Willamette partnership. That was an angle that they did want to look at, but we did not have that time into the scope, as we just focused solely on the IRS codes. And going off of with talking about the local identity, that was hence why we also wanted to prioritize the merger over the consolidation, because the merger would still allow for that local district to remain that, or that local board to remain then, so that identity of residents in that district would still remain, unlike with the consolidation, whichever was the nearest district that they consolidated with could be miles away and could cause distance between those residents and the people that they would talk to.
Great, thank you very much. Well, that is a perfect example, as I said to all the groups, how your work both helps us solve problems, but also helps us think about what are the right questions to ask to help us solve the problem in the future. So thank you, really great work. And Mr. Adams, yeah.
Thank you, Chair Trigger, Commissioners. So I am really pleased to indicate to you all that this is just the first snapshot of the work in this vein. So Professor Clark, working with a not-for-profit called Willamette Partnership, which works across the Pacific Northwest, providing technical assistance on a wide range of issues, is an EPA-funded technical advisor. And so we're continuing this work on Mapleton as a case study, but also looking at how this applies more broadly. So this is an excellent piece of work that's moving forward. And that, Chair.
No, I wanted to ask something I meant to ask when you were first introducing, and when Mr. Mokhtarsi was talking about policy labs. There are policy lab projects all over the country, but we are the only county, is that right? County government engaged in a policy lab?
So thank you, Chair Trieger. Indeed, there is a network called the Metro Lab. So the Metro Lab network grew out of the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House during the Obama administration and kind of spun out. So it was really kind of a concerted effort to really try to do, quote, town and gown partnerships to create kind of a broader-based innovation economy across the United States, to really bring the research out of the halls of academia and onto main streets to make that work happen. So we are indeed a very, very rare duck with respect to our partnership with a county government and an R1 university. But Professor Clark has represented our local policy lab at that national scale at a conference last year, and we had students who were recognized for excellence in some of the presentations, some of whom presented to you in previous years.
Thank you. It's surprising to me, but it's so important because all of your presentations speak to services that we provide in many cases through state statute and around emergency response, providing healthcare and behavioral health services, around special districts and taxation. So it's such a logical partnership. I'm really grateful that we do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Chair, I know there's additional business before the board, but I wonder, Chair, if you would entertain perhaps a very brief recess so we could capture photographs of the student groups with each of you, perhaps here in front of the dais?
I think that would be great. Did you want to do each group or the whole?
Perhaps let's do each group solo.
Okay.
We'll just take them in the order of presentation. We'll have the students join the board here.
Jeff, do you need us to pinch in a little bit on here, or do you want us to stay up here or come down in front? Yeah, okay.
All right.
And we will, for Metro's sake, so we don't, if you'd like, Tim, I can see you up in the booth. Shall we do a 5-minute recess while we do the photos? Yeah? Okay. You want to keep rolling? Okay, we'll keep rolling and the public can enjoy watching us shuffle around and take pictures.
You want us up here?
And if we could, because we do have continuing business. Okay.
They're going to block the signs anyways. Right. Does that sound good? What's that? In front? Oh, sure. Absolutely. I'll make it seem less, great organization. Like Supreme Court. Like, have your robes on and standing up at elevated. Devin handed me the camera and then said you just push the button, so. Okay. All right. Say Robert's rules on 3. All right. 1, 2, 3. Yep. Okay. 1, 2, 3. All right, perfect. Great. Okay, thank you. Right, and then I think it was Wildfire Communications? Yes. Yes, okay. All right, come on in. All right. 1, 2, 3. Another. And 1, 2, 3. All right. Excellent. Okay, Evan's gonna see my pictures and be like, "You're not allowed to touch my camera again." I've done that before on my phone. All right. I'll scoot in just a hair. Just the space. Your spacing was a little. All right. 1, 2, 3. Hear that rapid fire? We have one more. All right. One more with Mason. Solo adventure. Good job, guys.
almost got it. All right. 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2. There's such good policy stuff hearing all the ORS. So good. So good. Thank you. Thank you for doing that. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Vice Chair.
Get us reassembled. Thank you, folks. We are going to continue our business here, try to wrap us up shortly. Our administrator had to briefly step away, so Assistant County Administrator Greg Rickoff is with us for the moment until Mr. Mokrajski can rejoin. So just to take a breath after that wonderful presentation and work and transition us. This is for the benefit of getting us all on the same page, and for anyone watching, this is sort of carry forward business that we weren't able to conclude yesterday before our time certain executive session. And the question before us is potential next steps on an open assignment, which was asking staff, specifically our Office of County Counsel, to prepare some materials to be added to a public hearing on June 26th regarding recommended Lane County Charter amendments. And so we can sort of try to pick up where we left off as best we can, but I think we were running into some challenges and questions, and some commissioners were feeling maybe a little boxed in about how much we could discuss on the item yesterday to help us wrestle with this based on some attorney-client privileged information from our Office of Legal Counsel was, I think, where we sort of hit the biggest bump in the road on moving forward on this item. So with that, I'll open things up and see if anyone would like to kick the conversation off. Commissioner Buck.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the summary, because I do feel like I'm not able to talk as freely about the issue as possible.
Excuse me, and I believe do we have anyone from Office of County Counsel standing by and available? I know they were going to be monitoring. Great. Looks like Steve Thiel from our Office of County Counsel is. Thank you so much, sir. Sorry, Commissioner, please continue. Thank you.
And a part of not being able to talk as freely about the subject is because we received attorney-client privilege information. So I guess my question to the rest of the board, in order to be able to facilitate the conversation a little bit easier, is do we want to waive that attorney-client privilege information that was provided on this particular subject only in order to maybe flesh out the concerns with moving this forward?
So I think that would, I'm not sure, I think that would just require a motion to do so, and if it receives a second, we can discuss the merits of whether to do that, and it would just require a majority of the board to agree that we wanted to be able to discuss that legal memo. Commissioner Farr?
Thank you, Chair. And maybe a couple of things I can say could help us to preclude needing to do so. I guess I'll talk about my thoughts on this and my intent on this. My intent is to supplement information that's been provided to us already with more information to help us make a better decision. We have a first public hearing that is in front of us on June, is it the 25th, Mr. Rickoff? 26th, I think is what we've determined. It's the first of the public hearings. However, the record is open, so we are currently receiving public input from a variety of sources. We all are from a variety of sources regarding how we move forward. So what is it? I'm trying to determine what our all collective outcome is that we'd like to achieve on this. And what we would like to achieve is when we do make a recommendation for a ballot item revising the charter, that we've looked at the input that's available to us, not just a limited scope of input, but a broad cross-section of the input. And I'm hoping that we would act in accordance in encouraging input from as many sources as possible. Now, that being said, how do we move forward with this next public hearing, the first one that we've had, but not the last one, I'm presuming, hoping and expecting not the last one, as we move forward toward what is the deadline date for submitting for the November ballot. So what is it we're trying to achieve? And I hope that I've stated it, that we want as much input from as many sources as possible. We do have input from a charter review committee that was created by this Board of County Commissioners. They did work over a period of time, and they solicited input. But their input, once again, was from a pretty limited cross-section of residents of Lane County. And as we move forward, this charter affects all of Lane County for a long time to come. I personally want to hear more input and more options. The options that are provided by the Charter Review Committee are a single option. There are other options out there. That's what I want to consider before we make the final decision. And that's what, this is not, it's been characterized by some people who have called me, it's been characterized as an end run around the Charter Review Committee. No such thing. It's not an end run around anybody. It is supplemental information for us to consider before we make a final decision.
Commissioner Buck.
I don't want to impede a sharing of information, but I certainly don't believe that there's any hindrance to input. Clearly, this is something that we want to hear from the public, and we have heard from the public for well over a year. And we will continue to do so during a public hearing. For me, that is not a concern. Any information and people writing in for public comment at any time is welcome, and it always will be. I think we all share that thought. The issue is elevating it to a point without a full legal vetting and vetting through a process that we all agreed on was transparent and democratic to the public through the Charter Review Committee. And elevating it to a point that it's actually considered in a public hearing without that vetting. That's the concern that I have. And I think that's a basic concern of transparency. And without being able to go through that legal vetting in advance, especially when we have attorney-client privileged information in front of us that we can't share at this point, my concern is that it is going to put us in legal hot water. And we're trying to be as transparent to the public throughout the process of a public hearing and when we ultimately recommend something to the county as a whole for a charter amendment change. Like, charter amendment changes are a big deal. They're very important. And just reading cursory, although I read deeply, but even if you just read cursory, the letter that was suggested to be elevated to a public hearing, the suggestions of renaming the districts, specifically each district that we represent, is a form of gerrymandering. And to elevate that to a point where we're not even getting the legal vetting in advance, I think is a major problem for the process as a whole and going towards the public with integrity.
Just to be clear, if I could, I want to make sure, because I'm hearing sort of, I'm not hearing Commissioner Buck disputing Commissioner Farr's assertion that it's important to hear this as part of the record. I think it's a method versus the issue. That anyone, that this person who wrote this letter has the option to present their proposal at the public hearing, or initiate a citizens initiative at any time to make changes to the charter. That is available to anyone. And that what's at issue here is, if I'm understanding, as Commissioner Buck's expressed, that by directing our staff to draw it up as an order, that's skipping several steps of process and privileging someone through a commissioner's direction to use a process in a way that is not equitable, is not fair, it's not democratic. And on top of that, there are legal concerns, which again, we're not discussing in any substance unless and until we take a vote to do so. Is that right? Yes.
Then if I may offer a little bit further clarification, you know, the danger that we have with public hearings, particularly if we consider a public hearing to be late in the game, which some people may consider this to be a late in the game public hearing, is that the public who come or do not come because of this think that we've already made our mind up and we're just listening to them one last time before we present our already made up mind. And the danger is that people will look at it and say, well, that's the commission's recommendation. That's the only thing that they're considering in this public hearing. I'm not even going to go because I've already made up the mind. And I cite examples from my many years in elected public office that when public hearings are held, if the public hearing is very close to the decision point, then the danger is the decision's already been made. The public hearing means nothing. And I would like to have a public hearing, this being the first, and I hope, anticipate it's not the last of the public hearings before we move forward with a ballot item. That people will feel free to make their presentations, not feel inhibited by the fact that they think we've already made our mind up one way or another. And that's the danger that we're in, and that's the reason that I would support having this documented one way or another, not just this, but any other public hearing, any public information that's entered into the record, written prior to the public hearing, that it be available for everybody to peruse and help them to make their presentations, and also to convince them, to assure them that our mind's not being made up already, and this is just, we have to have a public hearing. Check that box off.
Commissioner Senega.
Thank you. Mr. Thiel, are you online there?
I am. Good morning. And once again, I apologize for having video issues, so I appear to be audio only here.
No problem. What are our options at this point to have this available at the public hearing, but not say this is county vetted? Is there any middle ground here? Is there anything we can state that says this is from Herring and Long and it's the proposal from people, not politicians? I mean, is there anything we can do in that matter?
Well, thank you for the question. And here's what I think are some potential options as I see it. One, as I think was presented as an option at yesterday's meeting, is to include the letter and the proposal from Herring and Long as a public comment that would be attached to the agenda and available for review prior to the meeting. A second option might be to prepare a board packet that would simply kind of introduce these proposals, making clear that they are ultimately referred by the board, but originated from public comment or as a public proposal, and simply tee it up for discussion. And then I think, and we can circle back to that because I don't know that there's a huge benefit to that particular option. The third option that I see is to prepare the proposal in a format that would look like the rest of the proposals and proposed orders that the board considers every week, with a cover letter attached to that again would make clear that this was a proposal that was made by the board, because technically that's what this is. There's no way for the public to simply put this in front of the voters outside of the petition process. So this would be a proposal that was routed by the board, but again, that cover letter could make clear that it originated as a proposal from a member of the public. I'll note that in speaking with Ms. Williams over the last day or two, she's made clear that we would have, despite the typical noon deadline today for submissions that we could get a bit of a leeway here considering the situation, and so that we can hopefully prepare those materials in a reasonably prompt fashion and get it on the agenda for the 26th.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Those are excellent options. Do any of those options for a public hearing set us up for any sort of litigation on this letter?
Well, I'll say, I don't know, and I want to walk a fine line because I don't want to say anything that may be privileged in a public forum here.
Okay.
I've noted the Office of Legal Counsel's views in private correspondence with the members of the board. That, however, would I think ultimately, simply reviewing these things in a public fashion is not going to itself set, I don't believe, put the board or the county at risk to the limited extent that we've discussed in those three options that I proposed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.
Commissioner Buck.
Thank you for the questions, and I want to just expound on that a little bit, because if the board majority wants to go with option number 3 and elevate this as a full proposal from the board for the public to consider during a public hearing, and we have already an internal confidential letter from you regarding the proposal, and we put forth that into a public hearing, I am and will ask about the legal ramifications of the proposals in a public setting, because I'll want to know that information, and the public should also know that information. That sets us up, though, for an issue of having to discuss the details of a proposed charter amendment from an attorney in town in a public hearing setting, but will need to be in an executive session unless we all decide that we want to waive executive privilege on the current memo and any future memos regarding the legality of this particular proposal. And so it does circle me back around to, do we want, as a board, to waive it and be transparent with the public, or does the board majority want to continue to elevate this? In which case, this might circle around yet again.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. And Mr. Thiel, the first option that you presented was one to simply attach this letter and any other letter that came in prior to a deadline that we may establish to the agenda packet, so that anybody who wished to peruse this letter could do it through the link to the agenda packet. This letter, any other letter that may come in. At which point we wouldn't need to waive any attorney-client privileges, we wouldn't need to go into executive session, but the public would still have an opportunity to look at this and any other documented letter that came in. So did I understand that proposal, the first proposal option, Mr. Thiel, is that a correct analysis of that, a correct characterization of that?
Commissioner, yes, I think you did, and of course then anything that's any issue that or proposal that's brought up in public comment or that comes to the commissioners in any other way is open to discussion in the larger topic of these charter amendment proposals.
Perfect. Then to add this as an addendum to the agenda packet, where it could be clicked on by any of the readers of the agenda packet, would we need to establish a deadline as to the final date that written testimony could be added to the agenda packet? I suspect that would be the previous Thursday, just like any other agenda item.
I agree, and I think that maybe Ms. Williams can chime in, but I think that's more of a logistic deadline than anything else, just to make sure that it gets up time to get prepared and uploaded.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Farr, because I don't know, Judy, if you're listening, but I mean, for public comment, it's usually noon the day prior. I don't know if it's different in this case, or noon the day before the meeting, which actually starts the day before the date of the hearing. So, Judy, do you want to clarify what the deadline would be for public comment for the item on 626?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And we did send out communications. Jenna Cusimano has been leading the effort, has I'm just double checking. I think it was just a couple of days ago. So sent communication to both the Charter Review Committee and a list of interested parties that have been in the loop since day one. And we are following the board procedures for public hearing information. So it's that Monday at noon. And we specified, even though it's a Wednesday public hearing on the 26th, we gave many options on how to submit both written, oral, and other testimony, but the actual written is the Monday at noon.
Thank you. Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. I'm leaning toward this particular option that does allow people to actually click on the agenda packet and read this and other letters. So far we've reached out as extensively as we have using the means that we have. And you sent a correspondence to interested parties. Now, interested parties at this point in time are self-designated interested parties. There are people out there who are interested or would be interested who don't even know that we're going through the process right now. And that's a part of this public hearing, is making sure that people know that we haven't made our mind up, that we have a proposal that's been presented to us by our designated committee, and that other proposals will be entertained or other suggestions will be entertained as we move through the public process. So I'll listen to further discussion, but to me that seems like a viable option to get this and other letters in front of the public for their comment.
Yeah, that's a viable option.
Vice Chair.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. Just if I recall, I mean, we seem to be getting in the weeds about this fairly extensively, and I'm just curious. This was brought by Commissioner Senega, as I recall, as an item that he personally wanted to see in the meeting. Do I have that correct, Commissioner Senega?
Correct.
So I'm curious. As I read the charter again last night, I want to ask each of us, and including our county administrator, who's the authority of the county?
That's a pretty broad question, Commissioner.
It's in the charter.
Authority related to what?
Who's the top authority of the county? Who's the deciding?
The Board of Commissioners.
You're correct. Section 7:3 says the board shall be the governing body of the district. Section 9, it says where the powers are vested. It says in part, all powers of the county, both legislative and administrative, shall be vested in the Board of County Commissioners. Now, a county commissioner made a recommendation of something they wanted to put in a meeting, and they have the absolute right to do that. The administrative power of the board shall be exercisable by it or by persons under its authority. Then I want to also mention something else. Section 35 of the Charter Review Committee, line 2. It's a time frame. The members shall immediately begin to meeting with the review and current charter and shall report back to the Board of County Commissioners with recommendations for any suggested changes no later than July 1, 2000, whatever. This is here, it clearly states that a county commissioner who is the governing body and authority of this Lane County that we live in can bring forth an item they want to bring forth, period. And that the Charter Review Committee's position is a recommender of said principles and ideas. The county board is the final decider. The buck stops here. So I'm not really sure why we're debating whether or not this letter is legal or not. I'm in agreement with Commissioner Farr. We should just put it on the comment section of the public review, let the public look at it, and let's talk about it, all of it, at the meeting coming up on the 26th, because my fellow commissioner wanted to talk about it, and we should honor that. Thank you.
So am I hearing that considering this letter as public comment and uploading it with the agenda packet for the hearing is where we're going?
Correct.
I see 5 heads nodding. And Mr. Thiel, is that clear to you as I read that? There's nothing further required in terms of staff preparation, and it's simply something for Ms. Williams to include as part of the public comment associated with the meeting that is actually the 25th, which the 26th is part of that meeting. So it would just go in the public comment for that packet. Is that right?
Chair, I believe we're on the same page, yes. I believe that's correct. And just to clarify, the board is not asking for any appendices or any addendums or any kind of other material be prepared to accompany the letter as it was submitted to the county. Is that accurate?
That's what I'm hearing from my colleagues. That's what I'm seeing heads nodding. Commissioner Farr.
And just one thing I'd say about that is that this is a step in a democratic, transparent process of public involvement that leads us to an ultimate decision as to how we as a Board of Commissioners make our final decision, which we're not close to yet. So thank you.
That's right. Thank you for that reminder. And the last thing on this item, I believe this is the last thing for today that I just want to be sure, I don't know if this is a question for Ms. Williams, for our administrator, regarding a timeline. This is internally driven and determined work. Elections happen every year. So if this body can come to decisions about whether or not to put all proposals to the voters, that could happen this November, it could happen next May, it could happen the following November, and so on and so forth. So we don't need to feel but so compelled about one particular date. To your point, Commissioner Farr, that we want to give this some time to breathe and let the public have maximum opportunity to be aware and give input. Great. All right. Is there any other business before us then? And if not, I will read us into exec. Yes, Commissioner Farr.
Trigger, something I was going to mention during items, and I apologize. Very quickly, the Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission has a recycling of water, reuse of water that has been flushed down the drain. We do a really good job in a lot of different ways, we being all of us in Lane County, through the MWMC, do a really good job of doing that. We were recently honored with I would call it a documentary that in part highlights the work of NWMC in recycling water. I'm going to forward that to everybody. It's a YouTube, and it's fun to watch, and it's nice to be a part of a county that really is ahead of the curve in so many ways, including the recycling of used water.
Great, thank you. Seeing nothing else from the administrator, I'm going to read us in. We do have an executive session this afternoon. It's a 1:30 time certain in the Board of County Commissioners conference room. And unless for some reason we come out into executive session from that, we would, at the conclusion of that executive session, be adjourned until Tuesday, the 25th of June. We are down next week in honor of the Juneteenth holiday. And so, pull up the right one here. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to consider information or records that are exempt by law from public inspection. This executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.6602F, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are precluded from attending. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. Members of the news media are not allowed to tape, video record, or otherwise record an executive session. Verbatim notes are prohibited. No decision will be made in executive session. We do reserve the right to come back out into public session should the need arise.